Most of what goes on in sport goes on off the playing field.
It's about what you have on them in order to protect yourself.
I was first raped violently.
Well, you're finished. You'll never play football again.
Obviously, shoe contracts worth $400,000 or $500,000.
Morals and ethics don't exist above and beyond the society that they're a part of.
Nowadays, kids are faced with the choice of do you want a couple of $1 million or your college degree?
Sport is a metaphor for what goes on in the real world.
Important issues are addressed at summit conferences, and the Summit on Sports and Society is no different. On May 20th through the 22nd, 1998, many of the leading participants in sports and society issues met to open a dialogue. Keynote addresses, panel discussions, and interviews by leading sports figures, scholars, activists raised issues and suggested strategies for confronting problems in sports such as racism, sexism, stereotyping, gamesmanship, violence, and commercialism. It was surprising to some that many of the ethical and social issues which arise in medicine, law, education, government, business, and the sciences also arise in sports. Before we focus on specific ethical and management issues, let's relive some moments from the summit and consider some issues in sports and society.
Most of what goes on in sport goes on off the playing field, and that's where the ethical questions really arise.
Obviously, shoe contracts worth $400,000 or $500,000. Television shows worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Multi-year contracts worth millions of dollars. All of those, this is a big business now, a very big business in those particular situations. So we're talking about a lot of money because this society has an insatiable thirst for sports, and they're willing to pay the price.
Sometimes success can be a problem. I was in college and there were two professional basketball leagues. One of them was trying to get me to leave college. And I had to make a choice as to whether or not I wanted a couple of $100,000 or my college degree. For me, it was easy. Nowadays, kids are faced with the choice of do you want a couple of $1 million or your college degree? The stakes have gone up.
I want everybody to be able to participate. What is it that grabs people about sports? And what I've come up with is that, to me, it's the single most available vehicle for individuals to develop self-respect, self-esteem, and self-development.
You know, the sport of speed skating was something that came so much from within my heart. It was something that I thoroughly loved and enjoyed.
I was first raped violently by this man who supposedly loved me and cared about my future and my person as a leader.
The kind of levels of power that you deal with in the National Football League and in my particular case, the National Basketball Association, they'll destroy you faster. It's all about the goods. It's about what you have on them in order to protect yourself. And if you don't have goods that you can use against them in a very high-level poker game, you might as well not get in the game. And because they will squash you in a second, and they won't think about it because they have so many ways, either through the media or through personal things that they'll dig into, to shut you up.
The ambulance got me to the emergency room, and they took the x-rays before the team physician got there, and the resident on duty said, well, you're finished. You'll never play football again. You've broken your back. You've knocked 3 short ribs completely off your spine, and it looks like you've crushed the muscle that runs down the left side of your spine, and I don't know that those nerves will ever recover, and 30 years later, they never have. Within the next hour or so, the team doctor comes in and says, boy, you got a bad bruise there. You really do. You're going to be out for a couple of weeks. And, of course, I believed him. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to play.
If I wanted to, I could get people on any drug. I know how to get people around any anabolic steroid testing program. It's not that big of a problem. The question is, are the guys smart enough to get the right advisors? And in most cases, the answer is no.
I don't know if it's right or if it's wrong or if it's ethical. I don't know. Just listening to some of the ladies talk today, Mary's a fine announcer, and I like listening to her, but I don't want to hear Mary do men's tennis, nor do I want a female to referee a man's game, whether it be basketball, baseball, or anything else.
My experience as a lesbian coach and athlete drives what I want to talk about with you today, because I was a very closeted lesbian coach and athlete, both in high school and college.
President Mandela, as well as most South Africans, felt that it was the sports boycott that was the most important of all the actions against South Africa. When he was on Robben Island, they would read and hear about the people protesting around the world against sports matches with South Africa, and it was the first time they understood that the world community was starting to understand how racist and evil a system of government the apartheid regime had.
The issues raised by Kareem, Bonnie Blair, Diana Nyad, and others include the conflict between academics and sports in Kareem's situation, equality of opportunity for women in Dr. Boxall's case, rights to personal safety and the duty of professionals to protect their young charges in the case of Diana Nyad's rape. Dr. Huizinga shows that medical science professionals can help athletes avoid national and international rules and regulations regarding their use of performance-enhancing drugs. Pete Gent showed how the medical community and the teams themselves may face conflicts of interest, and they may fail to protect the athletes in their care and their employ. Richard Lapchick highlighted the value of sport to influence issues in international relations and redress social evils such as the apartheid. Each of these ethical issues have their managerial counterpart at various levels of society and organizational structure. So throughout this virtual summit conference, we will consider the practical management challenges as an integral part of the ethical challenges facing sports and society. The kickoff keynote address at the summit was delivered by the Honorable Alan Page, National Football League Hall of Fame defensive tackle and currently Supreme Court Justice for the state of Minnesota. Here he welcomes participants to the Summit on Sports and Society, and we hear his point of view on some of society's ethical and management challenges relating to sports.
President Castor, ladies and gentlemen, let me begin by saying thank you for that warm introduction and warm reception. It's a pleasure to be here. Now, you're here for today and the next 2 days to listen, learn about, discuss ethical issues in sport. And quite frankly, I'm pleased to be a part of the discussion because conversations such as the ones you will be having over the next couple of days will not only play a role in improving how sports and sport progresses, but I think to the extent that sport is a metaphor for what goes on in the real world, these discussions will have a role in improving society. You know, one can hardly open a newspaper, turn on the evening news without finding a story about some well-known professional or amateur athlete that implicates ethical issues in sports. All too often lately it has to do with the athlete's misbehavior, whether it be in uniform or out of uniform. We hear about misconduct and illegal behavior, including the possession and sale of illicit drugs, drug and alcohol abuse, and the use of violence against anyone who gets in the way, whether it's an opponent. You can almost name any hockey player you want, or you can pick anybody that was in that brawl last night in New York. A coach, and of course the name Sprewell comes to mind. A photographer, and there's the name Rodman. Or someone unconnected to the game, such as a bar patron, a groupie, a girlfriend, or a wife. And we hear about promiscuity, sexual assaults, performance-enhancing drugs, and a general lack of respect for both the games and society's rules and values. And what about the importance of sportsmanship, or should I say the rampant poor sportsmanship, the trash talk, the taunting, and that dancing that players do? Has good sportsmanship lost its meaning altogether? Now, image is everything for today's athlete, and I should say athlete entertainer, especially in front of the unblinking eye of the TV camera. Where once players sacrificed themselves for the good of the team, many of today's players are more likely to sacrifice the team for the good of themselves. The issue of greed cannot be ignored as multi-millionaire athletes and billionaire owners become the norm. And their primary objective seems to be finding ways to divide up what they hope will continue to grow and become an ever-growing golden pie. I mean, just take a look at what has happened to the Florida Marlins. Now, today's athlete isn't simply a member of a team. He or she is sole proprietor of a multi-million-dollar entertainment industry. And, you know, it's interesting, the media just can't seem to get enough, no longer even pretending at times to be an objective observer. The media does everything in its power to make things seem bigger than life, as though a lot of things that are going on today actually aren't bigger in life in their own right, without the help of the sensationalism that comes along. The more sensationalist story, the better it sells, I suppose. But do I really need to know the amount of Gary Payton's child support payments? Or do I need to know who he's sleeping with? I don't think so. Whatever happened to the day when some things were actually private? My last year with the Vikings, we had a new defensive line coach who thought that the best way to teach Jim Marshall, Carl Eller, and myself how to be better football players, how to be better defensive linemen, was to have us read the playbook to each other in our team meetings at night. You know, there were 9 of us in the group, and I don't know how many of you have had the opportunity to read an NFL playbook. I know 1 or 2 of you probably have. Those of you who haven't, the difficult words are offense, defense, block, tackle. Well, out of the 9 young men in that group, 5 of them couldn't read that playbook. Each one of those young men had spent 3 to 4 years in some of this nation's best academic institutions. Obviously, they missed out on learning how to read in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade, long before they became athletes. They, like thousands of other children before and after them, slipped through the cracks of an imperfect educational system. They were fortunate, however, to have better than average athletic skills, which allowed them to at least reach a certain level of success. But what about all those others? And while that was 20 years ago, I don't have a great deal of confidence that things have changed all that much. After all, the problems that plagued our educational system 20 years ago have not been resolved. Now, maybe it's time for the sports world to consider a code of conduct or code of ethics. As a lawyer, I was governed by rules on lawyers' professional responsibility. As a judge, I'm governed by a code of judicial conduct, which sets the floor for ethical conduct. Certainly, lawyers are not perfect, and clearly there are those who fail to meet our ethical standards. But having minimum standards and a disciplinary process in place, it seems to me, raises the ethics of everyone in the profession. And maybe it's time to at least consider that for the world of sport. And it shouldn't just cover athletes. It seems to me that it needs to cover athletes, their agents, and those who manage, own, and control athletic teams. Now, the ethical issues that are going to be grappled with at this conference, and trust me, in my talk this afternoon, I'm not going to cover them all. Indeed, there are a number that I'd like to get to, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to. One of those of which is the whole issue of gender and gender equity and the opportunity for women in sports. But the topics that you will be covering gain their attention because sport and athletics are so big and so important. And that's good. However, it's also, I think, important to recognize that athletes are only the very visible tip of the iceberg. They bring attention to these issues in ways that few others can. But from where I sit, I can tell you that these issues go well beyond the athletic arena. I will also say that I believe the solutions to these issues start right here, with people like all of us here in this room. Those who are interested in exploring ways to strengthen society's moral fiber. Now, that task has never been more important. Our world continues to grow more and more complex and more complicated. Every day, each of us is asked to make choices about who we are and who we will become. Now, those choices affect our well-being as well as the well-being of others. And it's not always easy to do the right thing in the face of powerful economic, social, and occupational pressures. Indeed, it becomes even more difficult when our nation's social values seem to stress winning and the pursuit of self-interest, not just in sports, but at every level of everyday life. Too often, the focus is on climbing the social and economic ladders as quickly as possible, without much concern for who gets stepped on along the way. You know the old sayings, it's a dog-eat-dog world. You need to look out for number one. Nice guys finish last.
Alan Page's keynote address set the stage for the discussion of ethical issues in sports and society and pointed out that at a very personal level, these issues affect the lives of many of us. Perhaps one of the most important steps we must take is to get clear about what we mean by ethics. Let's consider some ideas about ethics offered at the summit. Consider these thoughts and try to fit them into your own ethics and your own ethical tradition.
When I started, the idea of sports ethics would seem like a redundancy because we thought that that's where all ethics resided in American culture. And of course now in my dotage, the phrase seems like an oxymoron. I'm not so sure that either was ever true, and I'm really looking forward to these very distinguished people who are going to tell us where to look.
There are a lot of different ways of understanding ethics, and one way is a fairly narrow way about that's sort of the ethics we learned as children. Don't do this, and the kind of thing I say to my 6-year-old daughter, that's wrong, and and that's fine. That's part of ethics, a negative part, but ethics is, in a certain way, almost like nutrition, it's the study of a healthy life and how to live a good life. And one of the things that plays, and like the study of nutrition, it certainly got its share of quacks, and it certainly has its share of disagreements, in ethics. And just as we have disagreements about how to live a healthy life.
I'd like to start out with a very practical kind of a definition of ethics. And it's going to be a sociological definition. I'm a sociologist. But basically, I see ethics as sets of rules of respect for human beings. In other words, they're guidelines for being sensitive to the needs of fellow human beings. All right. Now, one of the questions that I've asked as I've listened to people in all of the panels the last couple of days is that are our ethical traditions becoming less important, really? Or are the contexts within which we live and relate to other people changing so rapidly that the ethical traditions that we've used in the past can't be revised fast enough to adjust to the new situations, and we're not developing new ethical traditions fast enough?
Morals and ethics don't exist above and beyond the society that they're a part of. It's not as though there's some, ethical, moral ground that supersedes society. These things are constructed by that particular society.
Very simply, don't kid yourself now. No one's getting away with anything. If you do something wrong, you're being hurt by it, and the person you did it to is being hurt by it. No one's getting away with anything. Because the whole idea of ethics is to make you who are not yet, you who are not perfect, perfect. And you only got so much time. And if you don't do that and don't have it done to you, and you're wasting time, you're an unsuccessful person. You may be a successful athlete, you may be a successful professor, successful photographer, but you're not a successful person. You haven't become the kind of person you ought to be. And it has to be done by voluntary action. So if you cheat, if you lie, if you steal, if you do what you think is wrong, or if you haven't addressed yourself to all the things you ought to address yourself to, and therefore by omission are not doing what's right, you're not going to get away with it. You're not going to become the kind of person you ought to be.
For the purposes of the virtual summit, we may characterize an ethics issue as a conflict of values, conflict of preferred consequences, or conflict of rights or responsibilities. We may say that anyone who has such a conflict has an ethical issue that needs to be addressed. In sports management, the ethical issues which arise from sports-related moral conflicts can be referred to as sports ethics issues. Situations which require difficult management decisions often contain ethical issues, so anyone with a strong interest in sports management issues are well advised to focus on those ethical issues in sports which must be managed. While most of us understand what it means to be confronted by a management problem, it's not clear just what counts as sport. Clearly, soccer, baseball, cricket, and golf are sports, but chess and rock climbing may or may not fit some people's definition. Before entering into the conversation, it might serve us well to consider Dr. Jan Boxall's ideas depicting a paradigm of sports that may be useful in our discussions here at the virtual summit.
So I began to look at what the nature of sport was, and I've come up with sort of some paradigms. And the paradigms are that it's a freely chosen voluntary activity designed for no other goal except itself. So the end is within itself, right? It's an artificial background, it's an artificial floor. You take the football field, these are all artificial sequences. And you take them out of the regular workaday world, right? And you develop a sense of creativity, right? Self-expression and self-development that makes you not only feel good about yourself, but feel good about the person that's challenging you to do your best. It's also a rule-governed activity. There's all kinds of rules, right? Rules that define the activity, the rules of the game, as well as rules of decency. And we change those rules all the time in order to make the game challenging as well as make the game fair.
Ethics, as an area of study, permits a wide range of opinions. As we just heard, even those schooled in the area of ethics have differences of opinion. For some, ethics requires absolutes. For others, ethics is an outgrowth of society. For still others, ethics is a very personal way of life, as essential as nutrition. Different emphasis upon the public or private aspects of ethics, together with different definitions and even different ethical theories, all contribute to difficulties in resolving and managing societal issues in sports. The rape of Diana Nyad, the professional football players who could not read, Kareem's choice between hundreds of thousands of dollars or a college education, Pete Gent's debilitating back injury and the team's indifference to his suffering, and the medical profession's abdication of their responsibilities are only a few of the issues we discuss at the virtual summit: sports and society, ethics, management, and decision-making.
I want to thank the organizers of this conference, because I think this should be part of a larger discourse or set of discussions that need to go on through the entire country about how to come up with the kinds of ethical traditions, rules of respect that we need to fit a new world.
To participate in the virtual summit conference on sports and society, visit us at www.philosophylab.com, and we will welcome you into the ongoing conference discussion.